Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Welcome to you wherever you're watching from. I am Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and I welcome you on behalf of the members of our leadership team, former Congressman Mel Levine and former Los Angeles County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky. Many thanks to Nancy MacLean for joining us here tonight, and she has laryngitis, but she was so loyal to her date, she did not want to change it. So we really appreciate that. Nancy's highly acclaimed book. It's an award-winning book, Democracy in Chains. Hope you can all see this. Is really outstanding. It is a disturbing, revealing, and vitally important account of how the radical right has planned a stealth plan for America. So we recommend that book. Thank you for being with us tonight, Nancy MacLean, and also thank you to the outstanding Patt Morrison for moderating tonight's conversation. Next week, next Wednesday, we have American journalist Marvin Kalb in conversation with Warren Only discussing America's continued anguish, Russia from Khrushchev to Putin. And he will definitely be able to comment on the current status of the Ukraine, Russia, America conversation that's underway. So that'll be a very important evening to listen in. And the following week, we have Ken Kachigian, the former aide to Richard Nixon and a speechwriter for Ronald Reagan. He will be in conversation with Warren Only. What would Nixon and Reagan say today? So that should also be interesting with the newly evolved, not so newly evolved GOP, which has become MAGA. And it'll be very interesting to hear his comments from somebody who really knew and knows the GOP as Ken Kachigian did and does. And now please welcome the wonderful Patt Morrison. Patt is a columnist for the Los Angeles Times, has a multi-decades career in broadcast journalism as well. She has scores of top awards, including Golden Mike's Emmys and Pulitzers, and she even has a hot dog named after her at Pink's, the most famous hot dog joint in LA. Patt, wonderful Patt, the program is yours.
Dennis, thanks so much. Thanks to everybody who is watching. And thanks to all of you who support this program with your eyeballs and also with your money, because that's what it takes to keep these programs going, to keep you informed and to share this information with people people that you think I haven't been hearing it, but should. So we know that you share and send along so much of what it is that we do here, the interviews and the links, and we appreciate it every single time. Now, we're joined by, of course, Nancy MacLean, who is a professor of history and public policy at Duke University, the author of the book Janice just showed you, Democracy in Chains, The Deep History of the Radical Right Stealth Plan for America. That book is a New York Times bestseller, a finalist for the National Book Award, and a winner of the Los Angeles Times Book Prize as well. Professor MacLean, it's great to talk to you under circumstances that, well, you seem like you were looking in a crystal ball all these years you were doing your research.
Thank you, Pat. It's such an honor to be with you. And Janice and your team, I just want to say thank you for this important public service that you're providing with these conversations. And I like to think of this as a metaphor, the fact that I have laryngitis now, because I have spent the years since the book came out trying to alert people to how serious the threat to democracy was from a very well-organized, calculating group of billionaires and the hundreds of organizations and operatives they fund. So we are here now, but we have lots to talk about.
I will try to ask long questions and maybe spare your voice a little. So the events of the last 10 days have pulled the curtain away from the Trump administration, its agenda, and they've revealed too what you've been writing about, what's been in the works in this country for more than 70 years. And it comes down to a battle between two visions of what this country is and what it ought to be. And the consequences of that for this country depend on the winner and the terms of the winner. While Democrats were looking at expanding rights and expanding the people who could vote, the demographics of voting, the conservatives, the right-wing conservatives you write about in this book, maybe pre-Magans would be a good way of describing them, they were locking down systems of democracy in anti-democratic ways in the service of liberty. First, how do they define the word liberty? Because we want people to be vigilant so that when they hear these words coming out of certain quarters of the political world, they know what they really mean.
I'm so glad you started there, Pat, because I have said for a long time now, I think we need to have a national vocabulary divorce. And we should give them the term liberty and keep freedom for most of the rest of us. Because when most of us hear liberty, we just think it's like freedom. And for most of us, freedom is freedom from domination, right? It is the freedom to dissent, the freedom to speak your mind, the freedom to stand up to your boss, the freedom to control your own body, the freedom to breathe clean air and a good planet, etc. For these arch libertarians, which are pretty much corporate controlled at this point, the people I wrote about, liberty means something very different. It's liberty for them and their freedom to achieve and dominate in whatever way they can with the money that they've made from their economic endeavors. So actually, as I show in the book, their understanding of liberty perversely goes back in some ways to John C. Calhoun, the 19th century enslaver, who thought
And senator.
Yes, exactly. Thought of government as an oppressive force, forcing people like him of great property to do things like pay taxes for the education of the people of the upcountry, or roads for those yeomen to get their goods to market. So it's a very, very narrow definition. And when they're telling the truth, as they did in the sources I quoted and in private, they will basically make clear that their notion of proper role for government is to provide for the national defense, to ensure the rule of law, and to guarantee social order. So basically, armies, courts, and police. The rest, they don't think we should have. Public
And
education, Social Security, Medicare. The OMB order just illustrated this.
we'll get to that in a minute. Just to clarify, that idea of property 170 years ago extended to human beings. And so
Yeah.
what they mean by liberty, and taken from your book, the insulation of private property rights from the reach of government and the takeover of what were public spheres and still are to some extent, schools, prisons, Western lands, all of this by corporations in a system that would radically reduce the freedom of the many. In a nutshell, they aim to hollow out democratic resistance, and by its own lights, the cause is nearing success. And that, to me, of many alarming sentences in your book, was a very alarming one indeed. How close are they to achieving that goal in this new administration?
Uh, well, sometimes I think in lyrics, and lately I've been thinking a lot about that Bob Dylan lyric. It's not dark yet, but it's getting there. So, I mean, we've watched this cause progress for, 70 years now, as you describe, but with particularly accelerating force when President Obama was elected, and they could capitalize on that Tea Party reaction to the first Black president. And also Charles Koch, who's a key figure in my book and the CEO of Koch Industries, a fossil fuel corporation. They were terrified at the prospect of multinational climate action. So that's when they really, really went to town and accelerated all of this. So we have seen this play out, this rigging of the rules, changing of the rules, from voter suppression to gerrymandering to union destruction to ending transparency in state governments that they control, the rigging of the federal judiciary, and of course the push to get that now 6-3 arch right majority on the Supreme Court. That is a Federalist Society majority that brings together the plutocrats' agenda to be free of regulation and so forth with the Christian nationalist base voters for Trump who don't want women to have a right to abortion, who would like to outlaw gay marriage, marriage equality. So they are getting very close. We still have time. There's a lot we can do, and we will talk about that, I'm sure, tonight. But if people are not sitting up now and paying attention and realizing that this is it, the inning we face now will determine the future. So it is not a time to go to sleep. It is not a time to unplug. You definitely have to maintain your sanity, hang with friends, do what you need to stay, sane and clear-headed, but do not disengage now or you're not going to have another chance.
We're going to be talking later in the program with all of you, and you can put your questions in the Q&A box. The last chapter of Professor MacLean's book is called Get Ready. So I'm sure she will have some practical advice about what you can do, aside from keeping yourself healthy, as she's trying to do right now, and keeping yourself vigilant and keeping yourself informed when you see something out there, to recognize it for what it is and not take it at face value. Because Professor MacLean, one thing that we've seen over the years is the mushrooming and the morphing of organizations under very anodyne names, the X for liberty or the Y for fairness, and which in fact are disguises for very specific agendas, often for very specific people.
Yes. Absolutely. George Lakoff, the great linguist and thinker about political language and framing, he has this one line that I love. He says, "Watch your opponents when they're at their most Orwellian, because that's where they're most vulnerable." So you will see from these organizations, particularly these Koch-funded ones, Americans for Prosperity, which we may talk about at some point, they talk about human flourishing, the human prosperity, all these terms that they have workshopped. It sound really good, but in fact, what they are doing is advancing the agenda of arch multi-billionaires who do not care about ordinary Americans, and in fact believe that because they are so grotesquely, morbidly rich, they are smarter and better than the rest of us, and therefore they have a right to rule. And no one has performed this arrogance better than Elon Musk since he started hanging around with Donald Trump.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit? On
About the
on
Elon
Musk?
Musk or the
Yes.
arrogance. Yeah, I mean, I think, just the idea that here is this man who is the richest man in the world, who was elected by no one, who didn't campaign on anything for office, is now, has an office right near the Oval Office, and he can be running an agenda that has nothing to do with what the rest of Americans voted on. Not only that, he is so arrogant and so assured of his own capacity to rule the earth that he is over meddling in elections in Europe, in Britain, and most disturbingly, in Germany, where he has been making vocal speeches and tweets in support of the neo-Nazi party there, the Alternative for Deutschland. So that is really frightening stuff. It is really awful. But I think it is also, he's kind of a poster person for this catastrophe of absurd wealth that we have allowed to develop in our society, so that these people can not just rig the economy, they've decided they're going to run the government for us. And this, I love the great names people come up with. A colleague of mine who has a great Substack called Can We Still Govern? He calls this Doge thing, Department of Governmental Efficiency, dangerous oligarchs grabbing everything. I think that really does bring home what's happening here. A supposedly populist candidate came into power not by being populist in the way most of us would be imagined, but by picking on vulnerable people, attacking immigrants, attacking African Americans, attacking trans people, and so on. And then he does that kind of puppet show over here while he lets these super billionaires run the policy agenda. And they're doing just that. If people happen to see an article in The Guardian yesterday, Mother Jones followed up on a document, came out, an investment prospectus for Americans for Prosperity, showing that they are going to be pushing really hard those first 100 days to renew Trump's tax breaks for billionaires and corporations, and to gut the regulatory state, and to use this Doge in order to wipe out services and programs that we all count on, as we just saw. I mean, we're talking about Medicare, Meals on Wheels, Head Start, all of these things being
It was like peeking behind the curtain in The Wizard of Oz. We saw
exactly, because these billionaires have decided, we don't deserve them.
Well,
We should just.
in this country, people like the idea of getting rich. Immigrants come here in order to take advantage of these opportunities. We make heroes, at least we have, of people like Andrew Carnegie. Some people lionize Elon Musk now. The heroes of the Gilded Age, perhaps different with this neo-Gilded Age coming up. But so how does what's going on now, as you describe in your book, differ from that American impulse to let's get rich, let's everybody prosper?
Yeah, well, I think they certainly ride on that previous history and that notion of kind of, the American success myth, right? Or the notion that the streets were paved with gold for immigrants from the right countries. But so that is certainly out there as cultural background. But what's happened with the current crop of billionaires is they have a capacity no one ever had before in this country. They have, for example, their own media network. Fox, first they won the revocation of the Fairness Doctrine in broadcasting in the Reagan years in 1986. And then that opened the way to the talk radio of Rush Limbaugh and all his imitators, and to the Fox network, which communication scholars and journalists have studied. Especially those hosts, they're not actually providing good news content. They are engaged in a nonstop agitation of a white Christian nationalist tribal identity, and making their viewers feel like they are threatened by the rest of us. And so therefore they must be in a panic state, and they must strike out, and they must do whatever Fox, is pushing them to do. So Andrew Carnegie never had that. He had to rely on Pinkertons. He had to hit people on the head and break up their strikes, and, shoot people on barges who were on strike. Like, that was a different atmosphere. And these also, and we saw this in the election with the sheer amount of money that can go in now to disinformation. And we had our other social media oligarchs, coming to pay obeisance to Trump at the inauguration and try to outdo one another in how much money they were going to provide for the inauguration, because they're grifters. They don't care about democracy. They have allowed their platforms to undermine democracy, not only in our own country, but places like the Philippines, because it's profitable. And none of these guys will walk away from their profit sources, even when they are imperiling the planet and leading to climate collapse. And I meant to say this at the top of the hour. I'm sorry, I forgot, but deepest solidarity and sympathy for you all in Los Angeles who are facing these hideous fires that should never have happened. I live in North Carolina. We should never have had a hurricane in the mountains. The droughts, all these things are happening because these you know, self-aggrandizing billionaires have flooded our information systems with disinformation and worked to make our political system non-functional so that we cannot stop this in this activity. And by the way, if you want another good book on that, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse has two fantastic books about how this kind of money has really affected our political system.
Well, good. Maybe we'll try to get him on here to talk
He's
about it.
great.
Yeah. So, one of the characteristics that comes through in your book is that in this country, we have different liberal, progressive organizations fighting for their interests. There are people who are concerned about the judiciary, others about labor, others about the environment. Whereas what you describe is a kind of unified field theory of organizations all working together, these conservative groups, to the same ends, each applying, putting pedal to the metal on the accelerator about the courts, regulatory agencies that would enforce rules on clean water, toxic dumping, and all, in a sense, an underlying idea that while profits are private, costs of enforcement and regulations are shifted onto the public. Is there a unified field theory, or has it just kind of come together organically and said, hey, we all have this in common?
Yeah, thank you for that. There's definitely a unified field theory. I don't have the quote in front of me, but Charles Koch wrote in one of his books that I read, so you don't have to. But he said, I often think, he was talking about his corporation, but he does politics the same way. He says, I often think of what we do as stone masonry. The skilled mason selects a stone and places it, and then places the next stone and the next stone to make a structure that is mutually reinforcing, right? So think about that. That is what they've done. They have groups, the Federalist Society to shape the law in the courts. They have their political investing to knock out all of those moderate Republicans that still existed, into the early 2000s, gone because of the pincers action of agitating the base and having the donors put in the dark money that they were able to after Citizens United. All these the think tanks that come up with the ideas, the state policy network affiliates that move the agenda in state legislature. I could go on, but it is very much an integrated operation with the division of labor. And of course, they have some differences among them, or there's, scrambling like there is on our side. But I fear that our side has gotten the message too late that the silos are not enough, that we have to row together, that we have to, understand the seriousness of the threat that we are faced with. And if we are going to prevail against that threat, then we have to think of the big picture, not just organizational maintenance, not just what we're working for in our lane. And I think this is going to come to a head over the next 2 and 4 years, where sometimes we're going to have to think, strategically about which of the many attacks coming down are the ones that will really shake up the voters and get them to understand how much they're being harmed by this. And not everything they do will have that same effect.
Instead of a fire hose.
Exactly. I mean, what they're trying, there was an article yesterday, I think it was the Washington Post, maybe the Times. I'm embarrassed, I'm still get the Washington Post. But anyway, it was all about, and Steve Bannon was talking about, they cleaned up his quote about flood the zone with shit and just made it flood the zone. But he said, as you used the phrase before, pedal to the metal, no brakes, no stop, pedal, just keep hitting them on every front. And it is very much the military doctrine of shock and awe. What they're trying to do is hit so hard in so many ways that in that military doctrine, we would be paralyzed. We would be so shocked. We would think we had no power. But we will get to that. They are already having trouble in moving that agenda. So it shows that if we are paying attention, doing what we need to, we can hold this up. We can slow it down. We may be able to get to the midterms in 2026 if we do our cards right, but ultimately we will have to deal with this huge threat of these arch-right, multi-billionaires, some of the richest men in the world who are trying to sink our only way of protecting ourselves from them, which is democracy, however flawed, wherever it exists.
So many of you are champing at the bit with questions for Nancy MacLean. We'll get to those in a few minutes, especially apropos of the final chapter of her book entitled Get Ready. So put your questions in the Q&A and we will get to them pretty soon. I use the unified field theory phrase. That was Einstein's dream, but here's another physics, astrophysics thing. The big bang of this was a man named James McGill Buchanan, who kind of laid out this roadmap at a couple of Virginia institutions that he founded and directed more than 70 years ago. Who was this man briefly? What did he want? How did he become this guru?
Yeah, so if you've never heard of him, don't feel bad. I hadn't either when I started on this research. I was not looking for James Buchanan or Charles Koch. I was following the story of massive resistance to school desegregation after the Brown decision and following the efforts of Southern states to privatize education. And I came upon this man, James Buchanan, trained at the University of Chicago, you won't be surprised, who had just gone to the University of Virginia in Charlottesville in 1956 to set up a donor-funded center on campus to advance this set of right-wing ideas. And I ended up kind of following him as he goes forward, is involved with all the major organizations on the front, on the right, gets involved with Charles Koch in reaction to the campus protests of the late 60s, and then worked with every single Koch-funded organization and many of the others on the political right. But what he did that was so powerful is he developed a theory of how government grew over the course of the 20th century and then the 21st. And the idea was that it was basically citizen power, right? Organized citizens who were able to do these things that they called rent seeking, and said that, and they come to this as extreme libertarians. So they were saying any of these things that the majority wins without the consent of everyone are necessarily coercive and therefore illegitimate, right? So public education, while Southern, white supremacists are reacting to Brown, well, that's coercive because we don't want to go to public schools. We don't want our children, white children, to sit next to black children. And you go on from there. Social Security, thought it was totally illegitimate, came up with plans to undermine it, Medicare, on and on and on. But what Charles Koch, it wasn't so much, Buchanan was involved with all these things, but he was more of an academic. I mean, he was an operator. But actually, Charles, I don't hate to spoil alert on my own book, but Charles Koch kicks him to the side in his own institution, George Mason University, at the end of the story, which Charles Koch now uses as a base for all these operations. But Koch found in these ideas what he called a technology to effect a political change that repeated experience had taught them the vast, overwhelming majority of people did not want, right? So how are you going to impose a extreme minoritarian agenda on a majority in a democratic society? Well, that takes some sophisticated thinking and some rules changes. And that's what he got from Buchanan. That's the technology.
One thing you emphasize about Buchanan is that essentially he was an ivory tower guy. He wrote theoretically, hadn't been tried in practice except Chile, and people can read about that in your book. But doesn't it fly against the realities of human nature? Because he would get offended, Buchanan, whenever anybody talked about the practicalities of this. You said that Reagan came close, but conservatives say he flinched. And you write, in the real world, people created markets, governments shaped those markets, always benefiting some groups more than others. But that people think, well, public schools, yeah, we really do. And that rich people should think so too, because it educates their workers, among other things. Public health systems keep their workers healthy and
Yeah.
working better. I think even people like Henry Ford had an understanding of this. So has this ever been applied in the real world in any practical sense, or is just human nature and the sense of reality too much for this abstract, scary theory to apply?
Yeah, I mean, it is just such an extreme form of self-regard and selfishness that it just, was really hard for me to wrap my mind around it. And I think it is for other people. Like, when I travel around the country doing talks about the book, I would always have people, sometimes men, but often women, who think about the next generation and the parents. They're like, how do these people think they can sustain a society, right? If they do these things. And, again, they are, there's probably nicer other words, but they're so full of themselves. They think that they have the answer, but then they hedge and they say, well, if we don't have the answer, like Peter Thiel took out citizenship in New Zealand. If he wrecks our country, he can go to New Zealand. Other
And
ones
Elon Musk
decide
can go to Mars.
exactly. I mean, they're all talking about Mars while they wreck our planet, right? So no society could survive and thrive with the kind of uh, uh, policies and ideas and attitudes that these people promote. And again, we can see that with the climate collapse and with so many things that are going on. There's a brilliant, I believe it was a science fiction writer, but who has this saying that the future is already here. It's just happening at different rates. Right. So, I mean, like when you look into those horrible fires, in Los Angeles, or what we saw, with the mudslides and the catastrophes that killed over 100 people in Western North Carolina because we're not acting on the climate, we have to start saying that's because of them. Right. And when, these things come through with the Trump administration, we need to be able to, point that Trump did this. These kids who aren't getting their school lunches, the grandparents who don't have meals on wheels, the people whose social security checks aren't coming because they fired all the competent people who work for government to do that work. These people are bringing on the abyss, and we have to stop them.
We were speaking earlier about the language that's being used. Why is it that MAGA supporters keep arguing that this is not a democracy, it is a republic? Why is that distinction so important to their agenda?
Thank you for that. You're picking up all these good things that I love to get into. So they say that because it's it goes back, if you go back to the John Birch Society, which many of these MAGA people, the older ones, were part of, and Charles Koch belonged to, his father was one of the founders, but that was a staple of John Birch Society thought. And it shows you when you hear this is not a democracy, it's a republic, right? And that is the anti-democratic sentiment coming through. So in technical terms, that's true, but this was created as a republic. And the most important words in the Constitution, the mission statement, is the preamble, and that is "we the people," right? So that is the crucial thing, and they want to get away from that. But the other thing is the "we the people." Then I forget where I was going to go. I think the laryngitis just hit me there.
It's the laryngitis going upwards from your throat.
Well,
Yeah.
it has a cold in the background, but
Understood.
anyway, yeah. When you hear that this is not, oh, I know what I was going to say. When you hear that this is not a democracy, it's a republic. It is. It's like a right-wing reflex because they hate the word democracy, the people who say it, but also it shows their desire to ignore, over a century of amendments to the Constitution by we the people, right? So the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, the black legal thinker, oh dang, whose name is escaping me at this moment. It'll come in a second. But he wrote a book called The Black Man's Guide to the Constitution. And he says, give me the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments properly interpreted, and I could build you a really great country. So anyway, so these amendments, the women's suffrage amendment, all the things that were put in by the people have made it. It's a representative democracy. It's not like a Greek, person to person democracy, but it's absolutely supposed to be a democracy. And when you see that resistance, it's people who don't want, their fellow citizens being able to
You
rule.
mentioned the Constitution. One thing comes through in your books is how people in this line of thinking, in this philosophy, are pushing for a constitutional convention, which to the average American says, yeah, great, it's 200 some years old. Maybe it's time for a makeover. But you talk about how perilous this could actually be if it takes it down to the studs and rebuilds it along the lines of the power that you're talking about.
Yeah, yeah. So the book came out in 2017, and then in 2023, and I had it in a footnote in that last chapter, get ready, about how they wanted, I had in the text what they were doing to the Constitution, and that they had their designs on it. But I believe it was in a footnote where I said more about the Constitutional Convention. This is a real thing. And if you don't believe me, Google Article 5, Common Cause, Center for Media and Democracy, you'll find a lot about it. But so in that 2023 preface, I went into this because that was another reason why this election was so important. Project 2025, which of course Trump said he knew nothing about and would never do, and now they're rolling out. And our credulous legacy media said, oh, he says it's not true, so it must not be happening. And you're thinking, didn't somebody count and he had lied more than 30,000 times by the time you were believing him? But I digress. But so what I was trying to convey there is that they are at 28 of the 34 states needed for an Article 5 constitutional convention. They understand the backers of this, which include the American Legislative Exchange Council, a group called Convention of States, and all the usual suspect donors. They understand that they will never get to 34 states, honestly. So they've come up with a new math. They call, I forget what the exact term is, agglomeration or something like that. But they're trying to claim every authorization through history, like back to the early 19th century, for a convention that wasn't specified. And all they would need is for Congress to do that. Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, is a longtime supporter of the Constitutional Convention and the Convention of States. And there's all litigation pending to tell Congress they have to do this. So it's a real thing. I mean, we have lots else on our plates to face. So sometimes I hesitate to even raise this on top of everything else, but it is their ultimate goal. And the reason is that through constitutional change, they could permanently shackle democracy,
What
not just
what would
election
what would some of the more
change.
substantial elements of a new constitution look like? And please take another sip of
Thank you.
your
Um,
beverage there. I think you need it to
yes, it's
keep us
hot water
informed.
and honey. I'll take so two of the ones that are most common and popular that they talk about are um, uh, requiring an annually balanced budget, and at the same time ending the income tax, right?
Sure,
So
so
that
people say that sounds great. What's wrong with that?
well, what's wrong with that is everything that you care about, every program you depend on, would die under that regime. So it would be a stranglehold. But to just show you how deeply ideological this is, another thing that they have talked about, and you can find this in Mark Levin's book, The Liberty Amendments, of which he has 12. And one of them is to repeal the amendment for direct election of U.S. senators from the progressive era. They
Which
want the
we used to have
corporations.
legislatures vote for
Exactly.
senators rather than voters vote for senators.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. But basically, they could, and they will say their argument for the convention is that they can restrict it to just a few amendments. And every constitutional expert that you can talk to who's not in their cause, and they are not particularly outstanding ones, will tell you, and all you have to do is look at the text of Article 5 of the Constitution. There are no guardrails. I explain why in that new preface. It has interesting stuff from 1787 about why it happened that way. But but there are no guardrails. And any there is a group, broadly on the left, progressive, called Wolf Pack, that says, hey, bring it on. As you said, this Constitution's problematic. We need to get Citizens United overturned. We need to do all these things. So they say, bring it on. But I say they're a bunch of arrogant young men because they don't understand how well organized the other side is. They've actually had three mock conventions in colonial Williamsburg to practice for a
Yeah.
constitutional convention. Well, most people on our side don't even know that it's happening. So we need to get up to speed.
Let's let Nancy MacLean take another couple of sips of her honey and
Thank you.
hot water to treat her laryngitis. We'll be getting into very short, very few minutes here to some of your questions for her about her book, Democracy in Chains, The Deep History of the Radical Right's Stealth Plan for America. Its last chapter in particular, Get Ready, will give you some ideas about what she has to say about things that you can do on your own and as organizations, as communities, to look at the risks that she outlines and to see what it is that you can do about them. So go on the Q&A box and put your question in here, and we'll be getting to some of them in a very few minutes. You spent some time talking about how Christianity has become kind of a shield to some of the policies that these organizations want to pursue, and how unchristian some of them seem to be. And it's why you see splits within some religious communities over this. We just saw the Quakers, for example, suing over some of the immigration policies of the new Trump administration. And this Mr. Buchanan we talked about as the Big Bang origin of a lot of this thinking, said as society we may be too compassionate for our own well-being or for an orderly and productive society. This is something that the Reagan administration ran into when the OMB director, David Stockman, tried to enforce some of the tenets of the early Reagan administration. He said, by 1982, I knew the Reagan Revolution was impossible. It couldn't happen in the world of democratic fact because you're cutting programs that even Reagan voters like, and we're seeing that now with Trump. So Christianity, you wouldn't think would play as important a role as it has in a country that started as not an anti-religious, but a non-religious country. We don't have
Yes.
a state religion like countries in Europe. So where does Christianity factor into this as a tool, a defense, or an offensive weapon?
Yeah, as an offensive weapon, excuse me, in very shrewd calculation. And this is an interesting thing too. I describe in the book how in the 1970s, Charles Koch, and the Buchanan was virulently anti-religious, and they loved Ayn Rand, who's profoundly anti-clerical, hates anything that suggests altruism or kindness or compassion, right? So they were very anti-religious, but they also faced this obstacle that they needed to get the votes to get the people in office to move the policies that they wanted to move. And so the political right and the religious right, and that's not just Koch, it's broader in that period, but really began to come together in the late 1960s and in the 1970s. So, Jerry Falwell, the Moral Majority, the groups like there's the Council for National Policy brings together the religious right that has now become full-on Christian nationalist with the fossil fuel donors, etc. So it is a very calculated effort to harness the power of religious faith, to harness the power of religious fear in order to move a political agenda. And my colleague and friend Ann Nelson wrote a fantastic book about this called The Shadow Network, about this Council for National Policy. And there's a great documentary based on it called Bad Faith, Christian Nationalism's Unholy War on Democracy. So you can really actually see with that film how this is played out and how prominent Christian nationalists were in the attack on our country on January 6th. So this is very much involved in the mobilizations for Trump, and also in some of this goes off into, Pentecostal stuff that, there's no religious schools, there's no divinity school, school of theology. It's like you just put up your plaque and say, I'm, a church leader, and you can say what you want.
This goes back to the very early 19th century in this country too.
Yeah, but this notion that your fellow citizens are not just people who have different policy ideas than you, perhaps because they have different life experiences. No, they are demons. And so when you hear that language of demons, and if you start being alert to it, you'll hear it more and more. But that is coming from these Christian nationalists who want to make it so that we cannot possibly have a national conversation where we come together about, assessing where we are and what we need together as a people, because they have been persuaded that the people that they would have to talk to are demons, and Satan spawn. And it sounds crazy until you realize how widespread it has become. And again, how powerful. And with all of these things, it's really important to follow the money, because there have been huge investments in this, in Sinclair Broadcasting, which covers much of the country, in the news deserts. But you can always get this religious right-wing broadcasting in so many of these communities. Um, and they have also donors like Charles Koch, but not only, others have invested in the development of theology to, like, for example, undermine Pope Francis, because Pope Francis thinks like climate is a problem and we should be compassionate and welcome immigrants and do all the things that Christians used to be supposed to do. So it's such a big problem. But I think also, it's like Descartes. So, if you have a big problem, you break it into smaller problems and you figure out the problem. So we can't all do everything, but each one of us has a knowledge base, has networks, has organizations, has levers that we can bring to this. But it is quite pervasive and quite an integrated operation.
Let's bring some of our questions in from people who are
Right.
watching right now, and we can maybe spare you a little with some short answers as well. And Marcia has a question. So it seems like, the idea of rich men and privilege, as you said, goes back to Calhoun and certainly earlier. But she said some of the wealthy, very powerful men we see on the stage now, literally, were very recently liberal Democrats. How did they make the change to this republicanism that embraces, in her words, the demolition of democracy?
Really crucial question. And I will say that I tend to speak from strength, things that I have myself, directly researched or read deeply in. And I have not focused so much on some of the previously more Democratic allied ones. I can say that one thing that we're seeing with figures like Mark Zuckerberg and even Elon Musk, but there's almost a chameleon-like quality that is like the party in power is the one that they're for, right? And all of these companies too were facing serious challenges for monopolistic practices and driving competitors out under the wonderful Lena Khan, one of my favorite Biden appointments, who was really an antitrust advocate and really, really trying to go to the wall on this stuff. And Reid Hoffman, one of those people, he was apparently going around with Kamala Harris saying, "Let's get rid of Lena Khan," So we do have these problems on the Democratic side, and because of Citizens United, we all have the problem that the people who are deciding party agendas at the highest levels don't want to talk about the issues that most Americans are concerned with. People are concerned that for, well over half the population, their real wages have stagnated. They were declining. Household weekly income was declining, over the last few years. Nobody was talking about that on the Democratic side, about that. They kept saying, "Oh, hourly wages are up," when that wasn't the right metric, and people knew it, so they got frustrated. So I think, what we really need is a kind of root and branch attention to how much power we have allowed these billionaire actors to grab, so that they can then rig our system, so it makes it harder to address the problems they create.
We referred to the Steve Bannon phrase about flooding the zone, and you think of how the question of trans people has been used to gin up anger and to really distract people from larger economic problems. And Jim's question is, the first 10 days of the Trump barrage of executive orders just smokescreen to overload the public brain, to numb them and to discourage them. And is that the case, do you think? And is it anything new?
Yeah, I'm really glad that the trans issue came up, because I, of course, like most other historians and political scientists at this point, have been reading a lot about Mussolini's Italy and, the rise of the Nazis. And it's hard to remember now, but Jews were less than 1% of the population in Weimar Germany. I mean, they were really significant, artists and thinkers and, figures of different kinds, but they were a tiny minority of the population. And that works well for people who want to build power by scapegoating. Because you attack too big a minority, it's gonna be harder to do that, right? But when you can target a very small group and then you make them vulnerable, all the policies that were done to Jews, to put them in ghettos, to make them wear stars, to make it so that they would look different, and they could be more targeted, then that is all happening now to trans people. And we need to remember that when the book burning started in Nazi Germany, it was the library of Magnus Hirschfeld, who was someone who was you could say maybe he was like a Kinsey figure, Albert Kinsey, who did the sexual research in post-war America. But Hirschfeld was a kind of leftist psychologist who was doing this really interesting work on people who are transsexual, on people who are queer, and they burned that library, as part of this riling up the people. So that tactic is tried and true. The same thing, Haitians in Springfield, the things that were said and done, but you find a target that's so small that you can just beat them and create this reaction. It's really troubling. And the second part of the question, the first part was about trans people.
Let me find. It's about numbing and discouraging people, again, flooding the zone.
Yeah.
That everything becomes it's like chaff versus the actual target in the air.
Yeah, that is so important because this right wing specializes in dehumanization, right? And just saying awful, outlandish things about population after population. I was just at a meeting today about academic freedom and Duke, and it came up that our vice president have said professors are the enemy, right? So they're just attacking everyone, and that is upsetting.
J.D. Vance.
Yeah.
Just people don't connect the quote.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. But so, that is happening. They will do that. But they also, they have this phrase, we need to own the libs, right? And the way they own us is to provoke us and then to make us react in ways that help reinforce their narrative. So what we need to do is, somebody in my neighborhood used the example of if you do yoga, mountain pose, like really secure yourself, like settle down and think they're going to try to blow you every which way with all of this hatred and this noise and this disgusting stuff. But what we need to think about really, really clearly is where are they moving the lasting changes, right? Or the deep policy changes that will be very, very hard to undo. And if we can try to keep laser focused on some of that, some of which is unsexy, renewing Trump's tax cuts is not a sexy thing, but it's all important, right? Or some of the other things that they're trying to do to government. We have to pay attention to those things, and also, to my mind, too, what's going to be crucial going forward is to provide off ramps for those Trump voters who are not, the MAGA hardcore, but people who are just angry, or they're worried about, there were people who were worried about inflation, like anyway. So we have to help them see in a non-aggressive, non-condescending way, this is how these policies, this is whether, you voted because you thought you were going to get inflation, but instead, they're taking money away from your kids' schools. They're doing blah, blah, blah.
Why don't you take a sip and I will read these this next couple of questions. In fact, I'm going to combine a couple, both Jerry as well as Ruth and Catherine, John and Ruth and Catherine, what the Democrats are doing to stop this. I always thought that we needed a American version of the shadow cabinet that the British opposition parties use, that this is the person, the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, in charge of countering the arguments from the other side about healthcare or about climate change. So there's a lot of sense among Democrats that this is only about hand-wringing, that it's not really stiffening their own spines to stand up for what's coming in this wind, and expecting voters to do the work of what parties and the party and party leaders ought to be doing.
I'm very frustrated with the Democratic Party right now, and I worked so hard, as many of the people I'm sure on this Zoom did. But when I see Hakeem Jeffries, whom I respect, talking about getting along, how we have to find ways to get along with them after they told us these people are destroying democracy, or when we hear them saying things like presidents come and go, things that minimize the radical rupture that we have here. And we have an absolutely authoritarian candidate and party, and Trump is behaving like a fascist. And we have that conciliatory talk. that doesn't help us. All the people I know are so frustrated with wanting to see leadership from the Democratic Party tops that we're not getting, and clear language about what this is doing to people. I will say, though, and it almost gives you whiplash, because that was such an argument on the stump that, this is about the future of democracy, and then not making that argument, when he gets in, that's a problem. And Tim Snyder, who I'm sure is familiar to many on this call, the Yale historian of Central Europe, who wrote on tyranny, he floated this idea of the shadow cabinet. And I said to my husband, who hadn't read it book, he's like, "That's brilliant. We should do that." So I think that's true. The Democratic Party should get its best bench out there and start making these arguments really frontally and aggressively about how this agenda is hurting people. But I will say, fortunately, others were not, we're doing work. So when we were all talking about Project 2025 and how awful it was, and people agreed that it was awful, but they didn't believe Trump would actually get away with it. Well, now he's doing it. Fortunately, there was a wonderful group of really talented group of people who set up something called Democracy 2025. They have over 300 groups. I'm not sure how involved they all are, but over 1,000 cooperating attorneys. And they went all the way through Project 2025, made a threat matrix, figured out what the issues are. They're already doing the litigation. Like, you see all these court cases coming up, they've been key in that. So everybody on this call, I urge you to sign up tonight or tomorrow. They have an all hands on deck meeting tomorrow, 12 to 1 my time. Democracy 2025. You can just sign up, but they have working groups on all these different issues. If there are attorneys on this call, they can get involved. There's so much that can be done.
So will that lead people according to their interests to say, I'm interested in healthcare, I'm interested in childcare, I'm interested in climate change? Will that be a clearinghouse for people, just ordinary voters, to say, here's what I can do?
Well, I think their focus is more on litigation, but what they've done is bring together working groups in these different areas that are made up of the organizations that are on the ground doing these things. And I think that they're going to be, I'm an outsider. It's not like I'm inside. I don't know exactly, I just pay attention to them because I think they're good. But they're going to be doing communication strategies and working with groups, to mobilize. But I think that each one of us, again, it was wonderful to see how many different parts of the country and the world are represented on this call. But so I think people in their own communities need to figure out, where could they be helping? Where do they need to make sure people are getting the information they need? If there's going to be some kind of a mobilization, how to do that, and that work is really, really important. And I also want to say, because we have a lot of you wonderful people from the free world, the blue states on this call, and then there are those of us from the red states and the purple states. One of the things that Democracy 2025 is doing that I think is very important is leveraging the power of blue states to help those in other states. So if you'll see, like, there were the litigation against the OMB thing was on behalf of, I believe it was 20 states, on behalf of their citizens who would be affected. So we need to think of that too, right? It's kind of, again, back to like the 1850s. What can the free states do to the to help people in the slave states?
Let's get some shorter answers so we can get some more questions.
Sorry.
If that's all right. No, if it's all right with you. One of our stalwarts, Zev Yaroslavsky, referred to Timothy Ryback's piece in The Atlantic, how Hitler dismantled a democracy in 53 days. Felt like a warning. How close are we? Even with the missteps of, oh, we didn't mean to cut Meals on Wheels. Oh, we didn't mean to cut Head Start with this broad executive order. But Zev's question is well timed. 53 days. What is our clock with the Trump administration?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a crystal ball, so I can't say that. One thing I can say is we're not
Not on your shelf behind you there. I was looking for one. No.
We're not in a situation like that of interwar Europe, with a profound depression, with, the Bolshevik Revolution and all this other stuff. So, we can kind of yoga breathe a little bit, but I said, it's not dark yet, but it's getting there. We have to be really, really alert, and it will be the efforts of people like the good people on this call that will help answer that question. If we don't act, it will be awful. It will be awful. I believe we will see the end of democracy in America. If we do act, and we act smart and strategically, and we work with people that may not be people we would usually work with, but we work together, then I believe that we can at least get a breather possibly in 2026. But I don't know. I
Okay.
mean, look at they put okay, I'll just say Pete
No,
Hegseth at top of the military, scary stuff.
Pamela has a question about news specifics, and I'll broaden it out to news organizations, news networks, and the question of anticipatory obedience. CNN has come under a lot of criticism for
Yeah.
trying to sideline Jim
Yes.
Acosta. Trump is not a fan of Jim Acosta, and he left the network as a consequence. And there's just a lot of concern when you see what Jeff Bezos did as far as yanking an editorial in the Washington Post about a presidential endorsement, that the people who are most powerful, who have the most money to defend themselves, as opposed to just ordinary folks, are the ones who are quickest and most easily coming around to doing what they believe would be the bidding of this administration.
Absolutely right. And it's happening in multiple domains. I can tell you, I also am part of a group called the Center for the Defense of Academic Freedom. We just had a conference in Washington, and people were talking about the only college presidents that are standing up to this are from scrappy little colleges and community colleges, and you can count them on one hand, right? All the Ivies have capitulated. The other ones are holding their heads down. Why? Why? University Duke has $1 billion in federal contracts. This is the thinking that has infected our society. So instead of being mission driven, instead of acting with integrity based on what we know is right and what we know is wrong and our need to sound the alarm for our fellow citizens, we do see that anticipatory obedience. I think the only thing that will stop that is the rest of us finding our voices and saying, why aren't you speaking out? Writing letters to the editor, calling the paper, going to rallies, going to, talk to groups. But the pressure to not conform is going to come from people who don't have as much money at risk, because that's the.
We'll need a really quick answer to this one because time is drawing short. Sid has a question that goes way back about the gutting of education, especially civics education, and how that has made people vulnerable to believing some of the BS that has come out of, what you could say any quarter, but certainly the organizations that you talk about, the right-wing organizations who say, oh, no, that's not how democracy works.
I totally agree. We need much more of that. That's my quick answer.
Um, and uh, and two, we also have the sense very quickly again about this things like the Trump buyout program, a non-existent buyout program. Here, it's kind of a carrot and stick idea of take this 7 months worth of pay, or who knows, we may be coming for your job. Is this about an evacuate and refill with MAGA loyalists the entire functions of the government that Trump wishes to remain functioning?
Absolutely. And that was right there in Project 2025. And it is also the playbook of Viktor Orban, who Kevin Roberts, the head of Heritage, said Viktor Orban is not just a model of conservative governance. He is the model. And that is what Viktor Orban did. He
So
rode to
there are places in the world where this is working, but does he not maintain welfare programs in defiance of things like these Koch ideas that have come along?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, that is true. Like Modi in India has spread welfare programs to keep it. So, things vary country by country, but this notion of gutting the civil service in order to fill it with political loyalists is something that authoritarians do the world over.
I
And it
guess
has terrible consequences for citizens' lives.
we try to end on a bit of a positive note. So maybe I should ask where you think the best, most effective opposition is going to come from. Is it going to come from the courts? The federal courts will say, hey, we have lifetime appointments, so we have a legacy to think about. We don't need to put up with this. Are there going to be elements in Congress that aren't acting necessarily because they disagree on policy, but because they're defending the fact that this is an independent branch of government that has its own rights and its own responsibilities to push back?
Well, I would say I do see some signs of hope. I mean, the velocity of this machine has been gummed up. The birthright citizenship, effort has been, put on hold by a judge. The anti-DEI, also. So the courts have been doing some useful things, but I think it would be a mistake for us to just look to some other entity over the, whether it's judges or Congress or whatever. The core message I'd like people to take is we must all embrace the fact that we live in a democracy and its future depends on us, right? We must become active citizens. We must be vocal. We must talk to our neighbors. We must protect our neighbors. We must do what we need to do. And to me, I also teach the history of social movements. No social movement ever achieved something significant with just one brain, just grassroots or just, Congress or whatever. No, it's a multiplicity of things, and each one, further energizes the other, and then you get that kind of healthy combustion going. So we need to see each of ourselves as part of that overall project. I think of it as like a cosmic division of labor. We all have something to do.
It's a net. There are some big parts in it. There's some small parts in it. Whatever part you can choose to play, I think, is one of the becomes important to keeping the whole intact. And Nancy MacLean, her book is Democracy in Chains: The Deep History of the Radical Right Stealth Plan for America. Write another book really quickly and we can have you back on. I hope you will. And we sure hope you feel better. You've been a real trooper being here with your laryngitis and just soldiering on through all of this. And we're very grateful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Pat. What a phenomenal interviewer you are. I have to go look up all your other interviews, or at least even 10 of the amazing ones that you've done over
That's,
the years. This has really
that's
been
so
a joy
kind.
talking with you. And thank you to people for hanging in there and for raising all the good questions you did.
You can find out all about her on her website. We'll be able to give you information about that. Her book, again, Democracy in Chains. There's a schedule of the upcoming interviews that we have. All of these are preparatory to knowing more, preparing more, to be able to anticipate and see what you can do apropos of what's happening with the changes in government right now in this country. Thanks to all of you who were watching and listening, who will be watching and listening. And thanks as always to the organizers and supporters of this very, very important program in our lives, especially at this juncture in our nation's history. Thanks for watching.